Hello, welcome to the Deadly Analysis podcast in this special episode of Deadly Analysis Shortcuts. Tonight, Ben and I will be exploring one broad question. What non-film intellectual property would we like to see made into a movie? So the IP that I would adapt is World War Z. Now I see that you are going to already comment that this has already been adapted into a Brad Pitt movie. And if you've seen the Brad Pitt movie and read the World War Z book, you will notice that there is no way in which the Brad Pitt film is actually an adaptation of Max Brooks's World War Z. There are a few overlaps, but aside from that, it's a Venn diagram that meets at a point, and that point is the title, World War Z. So what I'm pitching is a HBO limited series that spans maybe one, maybe two seasons, that includes all of the complexity that are included in Max Brooks's book. Max Brooks's book is wide-ranging. It includes multiple characters. All of those characters get a storyline and an arc, and none of that can fit into a 2-hour movie. You need a 2-season, 3-season limited series, something that you could do on an HBO or, God forbid, a Netflix. So that's the format that I'm picking for this. And then that way, each episode highlights one character's journey over the course of a particular time period. And then the next episode follows a different character's journey over the same time period. And then the next episode, a different character's journey over the same time period, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can pick these up. So you get one character, like one episode there, and then in the 5th or 6th episode, it picks up with that same character again. This is actually an organizational structure that a British TV series called Skins employed, and it worked for that series. I'm thinking that something like that organizational structure would work in a horror movie for a horror movie storyline, and it would work with especially this IP, because anybody who's read this book has wanted to see it turned into an actual film, and a film that does justice to the IP. And I think that a 2-hour film has no way of doing that, but a long mini-series like what HBO would be capable of putting on would be capable. And if nothing else, it would fill in the gap that Game of Thrones is going to leave once Game of Thrones is over. Now that Game of Thrones is over, I should say.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned Game of Thrones, because whenever you're discussing this organizational format, I'm pretty sure that that's actually how George R. R. Martin wrote the books originally. So it's like you have a series of chapters or a chapter or something like that that's following one main character throughout a period of time, and then you kind of like switch over to the other characters and sort of move through each of their stories within the course of a single book over, again, that one stretch of time. And for whatever reasons, like the writers of Game of Thrones for the TV show obviously chose not to do that, and I'm kind of curious about why, because it is a really interesting format. As you've mentioned, another British show, you said Skins, decided to do that same thing, and it turned out to be quite successful.
It did for that show. I mean, that's a completely different genre. It's dealing with, underage kids kind of growing up and experiencing the things you experience when you grow up. And in some cases, it was a controversial show at the time, but I still think that the organizational structure was really interesting to me. It was actually Nicholas Hoult, who's up and coming these days, a contender for Batman, got his start on About a Boy, and then British television with Skins. So it was quite a few years ago, and there's some controversy surrounding it. But yeah, I think that's one idea that I want to steal from that show and put into my World War Z miniseries. What about you, Ben? What do you think? Do you think you're the HBO exec here? Would you greenlight my World War Z miniseries?
Yeah. So it's obviously an interesting tale, and I haven't seen anything beyond the movie, right? So I think just for the film that I saw, it is an interesting story, and like obviously there are a lot of different takes on the sort of zombie outbreak, kind of like schema, right? But
Mhm.
I do think it's an interesting story that stands alone on its own, and I think that any format that allows for the in-depth development of interesting characters is a formula for success. You know what I mean? Like the stuff that I
Right.
really buy into the most is kind of like those creations, like those shows, those movies that really allow you time to get familiar with a character, to like bond with them, to have empathy with them, and get interested in them personally. And I think that's going to emphasize sort of like the impact of a mid, like currently falling apart world, like not necessarily post-apocalyptic yet, but getting there. That kind of a situation, I think, yeah, it sounds fantastic to me. That's really interesting.
Well, what's shocking about World War Z is how many of the complexities of Max Brooks's book that the film elides. That is one of the most complex uh, zombie horror film books that I've ever read, because it's really dealing with some things that aren't explored in other zombie movies. Not explored in most zombie movies, like zombies just living at the bottom of the ocean, for example. And then how do you deal with zombies at the bottom of the ocean? That's one of the things that the film doesn't really go into, but a miniseries would have the time to be able to go into that.
One thing I would ask you too is how would you differentiate that from a Walking Dead, for instance? So like obviously that's a series that's been going on for a long time, and I think people, especially at the beginning, really associated with that series, just because of that character development. But that was a little more like post-apocalyptic. I think like the main catastrophe had already passed, and that was kind of like the premise, right? You have the main character waking up after the world has already fallen apart. So would
Right.
you say that this kind of what you're creating right now would be differentiated from that in like a significant way?
Yes, because mine would end. The Walking Dead right now is sort of this perpetual motion machine that is always it's we're going to the heat death of the universe is going to happen before Dead ends, and that's probably as a result of the and what some fans have experienced is a diminishing returns. Here, I'm only sticking with Brooks's book and I'm going to tell this story from beginning to end. And I'm not going to spoil the end of the book, but it has a clear, definitive ending at the end of the book. And so I'm going to stick with that as my goal. And then that way I have a limited period of time and a limited story that I'm telling, and I'm getting to that story, not this ongoing hour slog of depression every week on AMC, which essentially is what The Walking Dead has turned into, according to many critics. I don't watch the show, so I can't really comment on that, but that's what I've heard from a lot of people who watch The Walking Dead. So, what about you, Ben? What IP would you remake, or what IP would you make into a film, a horror film?
Yep. So this one I think is a little bit difficult, because what I'm gonna pick is almost closer to like what you would think of as like a short story, or at least it's kind of written that way. It's not very long, but what I'm thinking of is the Enigma of Amigara Fault. It's a manga essentially by Junji Ito.
So I don't
He's
know
been
anything about this. So you're gonna have to
yeah
gi-
yeah
give me a little thing. So I have
yeah yeah.
no idea any. I've never read this. I've never seen it.
So this guy who makes these mangas has become quite famous for what he does with horror manga. He has a very unique style, and there are like three main works that he's done. But he's also done like a whole bunch of different like shorter versions, or not shorter versions per se, but like short story type mangas as well. Like that you think of as like maybe like one chapter out of a book, the entire story kind of like arcs and closes out within the context of maybe like the length of a single chapter. Um, his artistic style, I think, is really why people enjoy his story so much. The stories are quite interesting because they all have this sort of like non-typical, again, foe or happening or thing that's happening. It's not your standard kind of like horror fare. It's not really about like serial killers. It's not werewolves. It's not vampires. It's not some ghoulish creature, generally speaking, that is kind of like the main antagonist of the stories. It's usually something a little like more bizarre and conceptual. For instance, in Uzumaki, which is the one that is about spirals, like the the main sort of like antagonist, quote unquote, of the story is literally the concept of a spiral, and it's quite Lovecraftian, and it's very interesting. So in this particular story, though, the Enigma of Amigara Fault, what kind of happens is we're introduced to the story right when there's this earthquake in Japan, and on this mountain a fault line opens where against the face of the rock you have these silhouette holes that seem to be just different shapes of different people. There's a lot of confusion about how they happened. They don't seem to have been carved into the rock. No one can really figure out what they are. But slowly over time, people start to like migrate there because they've seen this on the news. And as we find out, each hole is unique to an individual person. And these people are migrating to see this because they've seen their hole on the news, and they sort of like fit into it and disappear into the hole. Essentially never to be seen again. And so the way that the story carries, though, is that we have this main character who goes there and sees this, but he ends up meeting this other person, and there's a little bit of kind of like a weird like love interest, but it's like really short-lived, and you learn a little bit about her character, you learn a little bit about him, and then this horrible thing happens, and then the story kind of ends with you sort of finding out what happens after the people sort of disappear into the holes. It's quite interesting. I think what we have here, conceptually speaking, is sort of this weird outlining of fate, of destiny. Obviously, I think those are like the clearest concepts that we're dealing with in this story, but also the way that people sort of like seek their own destruction. There's this element here of kind of like the ancient world and like older civilizations with mysterious sort of like technology or power that do this weird thing, because there are flashbacks or like dream sequences where you see the original purpose of these holes, and it's quite interesting, right? There's a lot of seeding for really interesting concepts and ideas and storylines, and they just don't get time to be fully fleshed out. And so that's what I want to see in my horror film adaptation of this story, is our full reckoning and realization of all of these different storylines that we get teased about in this one chapter short story manga about this crazy thing, right? So what I really want to see is this be a deep sort of introspective character study about our main character. I want to see how he has sort of desperation and loneliness and isolation. I want to see him find out like that this crazy thing is happening in the context of his otherwise incredibly mundane, boring life that he's completely tired of. I want him to go there and find this other person, and I want their relationship to be fleshed out a little bit more. I want like a full arc for their kind of like connection and a reason for it. I want that connection to be based on they found each other in the context of utter bleakness and desperation, you know what I mean? Like I want it to be like an ill-fated sort of love. And then when that falls apart, I really want to see him completely break down and accept kind of his fate and accept his own self-destruction. Like I really want this to be a deep character study that really kind of has this weird thing that's happening in the background just as sort of like a background thing until you get your final payoff when you find out what the hell is really going on with these holes. You know what I mean? So it should be a slow build. The focus should not be on the horror of the fault or like the holes or whatever like that. Like all of this madness and destruction and these people, seeking this out, that should be happening around the character study of the main character and his final decision to just let go and fade into the mountain, as it were, right?
So
yeah, I think it has a lot of potential. I don't know, like I really feel strongly that this story has a lot of potential if it's done right.
I think it does too. I like a lot of what you're pitching. But do you see this as a live action remake or a live action adaptation, or do you see this as something animated? Do you have a particular director's visual style that you would like to see employed in this, or maybe a particular actor to kind of help me understand what I'm going to see once I see this on the screen?
Sure. I don't think it should be animated. I do think it should be a live action. And the reason that I say that, even though so many live action adaptations of manga and anime kind of like fall flat, I think this could really work because it's so almost realistic, right? Like there's not a whole lot of supernatural here. There's no crazy monsters. There's no wild visuals that you need to have. You could almost do this as like a low budget indie film and it'd be just as good as any like big budget thing, right? So I don't think it necessarily has to be in any particular style, although yeah, like I honestly I don't have any like directorial like styles or like actors in mind, but I do think that the emphasis should be put on empathy with that character, right? So like it definitely shouldn't be animated. This should be something that should be done in a style that like the general public can connect with, because the story has the potential to make that connection.
Cool. Well, it sounds interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see that, and the fact that the most successful manga adaptation we've got is Alita Battle Angel, and that movie sucks. So the idea of kind of rescuing this from obscurity and putting it into the mainstream, at least for Western audiences, would be a fantastic idea. I like this. So, what do you think about our pitches? Do you think that which one of these would you greenlight if you were our exec? We'll put Ben and I in competition. And do you have any ideas for IPs that you would like to see adapted into horror films in the future? And join us on Sunday when we talk about our next horror film. We'll have a roundtable discussion, a deep dive. But this concludes this Deadly Analysis shortcut.